It was one of those soft, sunlit Saturdays when the air seemed calm enough to make you forget the world could ever be dangerous. Fort Braxton Civilian Shooting Range was alive with its usual weekend hum. The rhythmic cracks of gunfire echoing down the lanes, the faint metallic scent of gun oil drifting over the open-air stalls, and the murmur of voices swapping stories between reloads. The crowd was a blend of active-duty soldiers, weathered veterans, and a few curious locals trying their hand at the sport. For many of the regulars, this place wasn't just a shooting range. It was a second home, a proving ground, and a place where the language of skill was spoken in tight shot groups and steady hands. Among the weekend crowd, a newcomer stepped in through the glass doors. Emma Carter. She moved without drawing attention, dressed in simple athletic wear, charcoal hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen their share of early morning runs. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. To the casual observer, she was just another civilian here to try something new, maybe on a dare or a whim. Behind the registration counter, a young soldier in fatigues, Private Alex Jensen, greeted her with the easy politeness of someone who had seen 100 curious walk-ins. "First time here, ma'am?" he asked over the background percussion of gunfire. Emma nodded with a faint smile. "Yes, first time." Not far away, 3 regulars noticed the exchange. John Ramirez, a staff sergeant with the 82nd Airborne, was leaning casually against the wall, a Glock case under one arm. He had the easy swagger of a man who had seen and done enough to earn it. Beside him, Robert Hayes, a sharp-eyed lieutenant, was cleaning his sidearm with methodical precision. On the far end stood Michael Turner, a retired master sergeant in a faded veteran's cap, accompanied by his teenage son. Ramirez chuckled and called over. "You picked a good day to start, miss. Lots of real shooters here. You might learn a thing or two." Hayes smirked without looking up. "If it's your first time, I'd suggest starting with a .22. Easier to handle than a 9mm, won't kick so much." Turner ambled over, resting a fatherly hand on his son's shoulder. "Ma'am, I've been shooting for over 2 decades. My advice? Start close, 7 yards, maybe, and don't expect to stack the bullseye right away. It's harder than it looks on TV." Emma listened politely, her expression giving nothing away. "Thank you for the tips," she said softly. Private Jensen slid a clipboard toward her. "Safety waiver first, and we require everyone to watch the safety video before hitting the lanes. About 10 minutes, covers all the basics." Emma agreed without hesitation and made her way to the small viewing area. While the video played, Ramirez and his friends swapped range stories. "You can always spot the difference between military and civilian," Ramirez said, loading a magazine. "We've got the stance, the grip, the confidence. Civilians, they flinch." Hayes grinned. "Remember that tech CEO who came last month? Thought he was going to be John Wick. Couldn't hit the target at 10 feet. Turner laughed. "Or that lawyer from Raleigh. Wouldn't shut up about his gun collection, then almost dropped the pistol when it kicked." Their laughter faded as the safety video ended and Emma returned to the counter. "I'd like to rent a pistol," she told Jensen. "What caliber are you thinking?" he asked. "We've got .22s that are perfect for beginners, or, if you're feeling bold, a 9mm. "I'll take the 9mm Glock 17, Emma said without a hint of hesitation. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Straight into the deep end, huh? Respect." Emma filled out her paperwork, purchased ammunition, and received her lane assignment, Lane 7, neatly between Ramirez in Lane 6 and Hayes in Lane 8. Turner had taken Lane 9 with his son. As she walked to her lane, carrying the rental case and box of 9mm rounds, Hayes called over. "If you need any pointers, just ask. We're all here to help." Emma set down her gear and began setting up with quiet precision. She opened the case, lifted the Glock, and checked it, methodically, but without any flourish. To the men watching, it was the kind of inspection anyone could learn from a weekend safety course. Nothing remarkable. The range officer, Sergeant First Class Davis, stepped forward and called out, "All right, folks, muzzle down range at all times. Finger off the trigger unless you're firing. No rapid fire. Clear." "Roger that." The veterans responded in unison. Emma loaded her first magazine, 15 rounds, with a smooth, steady rhythm. A small click as the mag seated, the crisp sound of a round chambering, and then she stood in silence for a moment, adjusting her stance. The first relay began at 10 yards. Targets swayed slightly on their clips. Ramirez was up first, his shots clustering neatly in the 8 and 9 rings. "Not bad for a warm-up," he muttered. Hayes fired next, tight groupings in the center mass zone. "Feeling good today," he said. Turner guided his son gently. "Breathe in, hold, squeeze slow. Follow through." Then it was Emma's turn. She raised the Glock, her stance neither military stiff nor clumsy civilian. It was balanced, focused, the way someone might stand if they'd been holding a firearm for years, but didn't want anyone to notice. Her first shot cracked through the air. Davis peered through the spotting scope. 10 ring. Dead center. Ramirez glanced over with a smirk. Beginner's luck is a thing. Second shot, 10 ring. Hayes shifted slightly, eyes narrowing. Third, fourth, fifth, all perfect 10s. By the time the 5th round hit home, the casual rhythm of gunfire from the surrounding lanes had slowed. Ramirez lowered his pistol, leaning to see her target. Hayes stepped back from his own lane entirely. "What the hell?" Ramirez muttered. 5 for 5. Hayes exhaled. "That's not normal." Davis walked to the target to confirm. The 5 holes were clustered so tightly in the center they were nearly one ragged tear. "Ma'am, this is exceptional shooting. Have you had formal training?" Emma hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "I've had some instruction." "Some?" Turner asked, joining the group. "Lady, this isn't some. This is expert level." Emma only smiled faintly, resting her pistol on the bench. "Just lucky, I guess." But luck had nothing to do with it. And before the day was over, everyone at Fort Braxton's range would know it. For a long moment after Emma Carter's 5th shot, the range felt different, not quieter exactly, but charged, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. The familiar thunk of bullets hitting paper was still there, but now it was punctuated by sidelong glances and whispered comments, drifting from one lane to the next. John Ramirez lowered his Glock entirely, his mouth curving into something halfway between a smirk and a frown. That's not beginner stuff," he muttered, as though saying it aloud might make the sight in front of him make sense. Robert Hayes, who normally treated the range like a chessboard where every shot was calculated, leaned forward with his hands on his hips, studying the clean, deliberate holes in Emma's paper target. They weren't just in the 10 ring. They were so close together that the black lines separating the scoring zones barely showed between them. Michael Turner, whose years in uniform had made him careful about throwing around praise, stepped closer with his son in tow. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "that's the kind of shooting that makes people stop and stare." Sergeant Davis, the range officer, was already walking down to retrieve the target. When he came back, his eyes were bright with something that looked suspiciously like excitement. "I've been running this place for over a decade," he said, holding the paper for everyone to see. "And I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen this from 10 yards. Emma glanced at the target briefly, her expression unreadable. "It's a good pistol," she said, as though that explained anything. Ramirez gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, sure. And I'm a ballerina." The men chuckled, but their eyes didn't leave her. Something about her calm, measured way of moving, no fidgeting, no overconfidence, was unsettling. Not threatening exactly, but different. Hayes, always the competitor, stepped into his lane and fired off 5 quick shots. His grouping was tight, better than most civilians could manage, but not that tight. "All right," he said, setting his pistol down. "Do it again, just to prove it's not a fluke." Emma didn't answer right away. She slid a fresh magazine into the Glock, racked the slide, and waited for Davis's nod. The second round of shooting began. First shot, 10 ring. Second shot, 10 ring. By the third, the murmuring in the room had dropped to silence. Ramirez, Hayes, and Turner weren't even pretending to focus on their own targets anymore. All eyes were on lane 7. Fourth shot, dead center. Fifth shot, so close to the others it disappeared into the same ragged hole. The sound that followed wasn't applause. It wasn't cheers. It was something quieter, a collective exhale, the kind soldiers give when they realize they've underestimated someone badly. Ramirez whistled under his breath. "Okay, Carter. Who are you?" Emma set the pistol down gently, her fingers brushing the frame like it was an old friend. She looked at him for a moment, her brown eyes calm. "Just someone who listens to instructions." Hayes shook his head. "Don't sell me that. You don't group like that without years behind a trigger." Turner folded his arms. "My first platoon sergeant couldn't shoot like that, and he lived with a rifle in his hands." Emma only smiled faintly, but there was something in her posture, the way her shoulders stayed level, her breathing unhurried, that suggested the question wasn't one she intended to answer. "Not yet." Davis cleared his throat. "Carter, you ever tried the 25-yard line?" She looked at the targets hanging far down range, then back at him. "Once or twice. Let's change that paper and find out." A fresh set of targets went up. The distance seemed to stretch forever, the white paper squares looking smaller than playing cards. Most civilians started to lose accuracy past 15 yards. At 25, even seasoned shooters could start to scatter shots. Ramirez cracked his knuckles. "All right, let's see if this magic trick works from way out there." Hayes smirked, but it was tight around the edges. This is where stance and breathing start to matter. Emma took her place again, adjusting her footing by half an inch, settling into a posture that looked as natural as slipping into a familiar chair. She lifted the pistol, sighted in, and let her breath flow out slowly. The first shot punched through dead center. A murmur swept the room. The soldiers on either side of her lanes glanced over their shoulders. Second shot, another perfect 10. Third, fourth, fifth. By the time she lowered her pistol, the target at 25 yards looked almost identical to her 10-yard sheet. One hole, slightly torn at the edges, marking every shot. Ramirez set his gun down entirely. "Nope, I'm not even trying to beat that." Hayes leaned forward with a scope, as though seeing it closer might help him understand. "You could cover that grouping with a quarter. Hell, with a nickel." Turner just gave a low whistle. "Lady, that's professional-grade work." Emma cleared her weapon and set it on the bench. "It's just practice," she said quietly, but the look in her eyes suggested there was a lot more to the story. Ramirez studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression. "You're not telling us everything." Emma didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she reached for another magazine, as though the conversation hadn't happened at all. And somewhere in the back of the room, the sound of heavy boots approached, followed by a voice that carried enough weight to make every soldier in the room stand a little straighter. "Mind telling me what's going on at Lane 7? The tone wasn't curious. It was commanding, and the man it belonged to would change the course of the afternoon. The sound of the boots was deliberate, each step sharp against the concrete floor. The regulars knew that walk. Colonel Daniel Lawson wasn't just another veteran stopping by for a casual round of target practice. Even in retirement, his presence at Fort Braxton's range carried weight. He had trained more marksmen than anyone in recent memory, and the stories about his time as a sniper instructor had the same legendary status as the man himself. He stepped through the doorway into the shooting bay, pausing for a second to scan the room. His steel-gray eyes moved like a marksman's sight, precise, methodical, missing nothing. He wasn't dressed for ceremony, just a weathered brown leather jacket over a dark sweater, but the way he carried himself made people straighten their backs without realizing. Sergeant Davis was the first to speak. "Colonel, we've got something unusual happening on Lane 7. Lawson's brow lifted slightly. "Unusual how?" Davis gestured toward Emma's target at 25 yards. "She's just put up two perfect groups, 10 yards and 25, dead center. Every single round." The colonel's gaze followed the gesture. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he walked to the target with the measured patience of someone who understood the value of silence. The crowd parted without being asked. Up close, he studied the paper. The holes were clustered so tightly that the black ink of the bullseye was frayed, the scoring rings barely visible. He ran his fingertips lightly across the paper, as if feeling the shots could tell him more than sight alone. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. except for a faint narrowing of the eyes as he looked at Emma. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried both authority and courtesy. "May I ask your name?" She met his gaze calmly. "Emma Carter." Lawson repeated the name slowly, like he was tasting it. Emma Carter. For a moment, it seemed to drift through his memory, tugging at something long buried. Then he asked, "Middle name?" Her reply was quiet, but clear. "Emma Grace Carter." The colonel's posture shifted, just slightly, enough for the seasoned soldiers watching to know that recognition had struck. "My God," he murmured, almost to himself. "You're Carter from Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion." Emma didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." The bay went silent, save for the faint hum of the ventilation fans. Ramirez glanced at Hayes, mouthing, "Who is she?" Hayes just shook his head. Lawson stepped closer, a rare smile flickering at the edges of his mouth. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the growing group around Lane 7, "allow me to introduce one of the finest marksmen I ever trained. Staff Sergeant Emma Carter, former member of the Army's elite sniper program." The words landed like a hammer blow. Ramirez blinked. "Wait, you mean Special Operations Sniper? Not just regular?" "Elite," Lawson said simply. "Not the kind of shooter you find at a weekend match. She graduated my advanced sniper course with a 98% accuracy rate at distances up to 1,500 meters. In my career, only 3 people ever reached that level." Hayes gave a low whistle. Turner took off his veteran's cap in a quiet gesture of respect. But Lawson wasn't finished. "She served 3 tours overseas. Afghanistan. Some of the toughest missions I've ever seen assigned. Carter, I'll never forget the way you handled that hillside operation in the winter of '09. Textbook precision under the worst conditions." Emma's eyes softened slightly at the memory, but her voice stayed calm. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Ramirez was still processing. "So you've actually taken shots at?" 47 confirmed, Lawson said before she could answer. Then he caught himself and glanced at her. "If you don't mind me saying." Emma nodded. "It's not a number I like to dwell on." The air in the bay felt heavier. Those who understood the gravity of that number said nothing. Those who didn't sensed it anyway. Hayes finally broke the silence. "And now you're nurse?" Emma smiled faintly. "Yes. Trauma unit. Charlotte General Hospital." Ramirez frowned, as though the career shift didn't compute. "You could have done anything with a record like that. Stayed in, trained others, gone into federal work." "I did what I needed to do," she said simply. "Now I do what I want to do. And that means saving lives instead of taking them." Something in Lawson's gaze softened, almost paternal. "And that," he said, "is why she's one of the best I ever trained. Not just because of skill, but because she understands when not to use it." Turner cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made some assumptions." "No apology needed," Emma replied. "You had no reason to know. And honestly, I prefer it that way." From the back of the group, a younger soldier muttered under his breath, "Guess we all learned something today." Lawson glanced at the long-range rifle rack near the wall, then back at Emma. "Tell me, Carter, think you still have it in you to hit 300 yards? Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Let's find out." The colonel walked over, selected a Remington 700 with a high-powered scope, and brought it to her. This should feel familiar. When she took the rifle, everything about her changed. Not her expression, not her voice, but her presence. The air around her seemed to sharpen, the way it does when a storm is rolling in. As the crowd shifted to make room for the long-range lane, Ramirez whispered to Hayes, "We're about to see something crazy, aren't we?" Hayes didn't take his eyes off her. "Oh, definitely." The long-range lane at Fort Braxton was a different beast entirely. It stretched beyond the casual chatter of the pistol bays, past the short-distance rifle stalls, all the way to where the air felt sharper and the targets looked no bigger than postage stamps. The distant paper silhouettes shimmered slightly under the midday heat, their outlines blurred by the waves rising off the ground. Colonel Lawson walked ahead, carrying the Remington 700 with the kind of reverence usually reserved for a ceremonial sword. He set it down on the shooting bench with a gentle thud, its black steel glinting faintly in the light. Emma followed, quiet but purposeful. She rested her hands on the edge of the bench for a moment, scanning the distant target without squinting, as if her eyes had already learned how to pull faraway things into perfect focus. "This is 300 yards," Lawson said, speaking to the crowd as much as to her. "At this range, everything matters: the wind, the humidity, even the heat rising off the ground. A rifleman who isn't paying attention will see a perfect shot drift inches off target." Emma picked up the rifle and immediately began her ritual. No theatrics, no wasted movements. She checked the bolt, tested the trigger's break, adjusted the length of pull against her shoulder. She asked for the ballistic data on the ammunition. Davis read it out, and she nodded, committing the numbers to memory. She crouched low and went prone, elbows planted in the dirt, the rifle lying steady in her hands. Her breathing slowed to a rhythm that didn't belong to the noise and bustle around her. It belonged to a place far away, a barren hillside in the dead of winter, the smell of frost and cordite in the air. For a moment, the crowd watching seemed to fade into nothing. In her mind, she wasn't on a civilian range. She was back in country, reading the wind through tiny swirls of dust, listening for the faintest cues. She had learned long ago that the rifle didn't forgive hurry. It rewarded patience. Emma settled her cheek against the stock, one eye closing as the other locked into the scope. She felt the rifle's weight settle into her body, the earth beneath her steady as stone. A pause. A breath. The shot. The rifle barked, the recoil pushing into her shoulder, the sound cracking across the bay like a whip. Through the spotting scope, Davis's voice came loud and clear. "Center mass. Dead center." For a second, no one spoke. Then a low ripple of disbelief passed through the group. "Again," Lawson said, his voice calm but his eyes gleaming. Emma worked the bolt without looking up, the smooth clack of metal sliding home ringing like a metronome in the stillness. She didn't need as long this time. She'd already read the range, gauged the air, felt the shot before she even took it. Another breath. Another pull of the trigger. The sound came, sharp and sure. Davis leaned over the scope again, then laughed in disbelief. "It's touching the first one. Almost the same hole." Ramirez shook his head, half laughing, half awed. "I've been in the Army 12 years, and I've never seen that outside a sniper comp." Hayes muttered. "And she's doing it with a rifle she's never touched before, on a range she's never shot." Emma rolled her shoulders slightly, muscle memory carrying her through the motions. "Some things," she said quietly, "don't leave you." The colonel took the rifle back from her, but not before giving her a long look. "Carter," he said, his tone low, "you haven't lost an ounce of it." She smiled faintly. "The skill stays. The reasons for using it change." That landed heavy with the crowd. Even Ramirez, who'd never been shy with a wisecrack, stayed silent. They were beginning to understand that the most dangerous people often carried themselves the most gently. Lawson set the rifle on the rack and turned to the soldiers clustered behind him. "You just watched precision most shooters will never touch, no matter how many years they practice. But the real thing to remember here isn't the grouping. It's the fact that you walked away from it, chose another path." Emma brushed off her knees and stood, looking out toward the distant target. In her mind, the white silhouette was no longer a shape to be claimed, but a ghost of what had been. She remembered each mission, the long waits, the steady breathing, the inevitability when the moment came. Back then, she hadn't thought about the morality of it. She'd been a soldier, doing the work assigned. Now, as a nurse, the hands that had steadied a rifle worked in different ways, compressing wounds, starting 4 lines, pulling someone back from the edge. She had traded one kind of accuracy for another. As the group began to drift back toward the main lanes, soldiers came up to her in 1s and 2s. "Ma'am, that was something to see." "Appreciate the lesson, Carter." "Respect, Sergeant." She acknowledged each quietly. No false modesty, but no triumph either. Just a steady acceptance, like someone who understood that skill was just a tool. Nothing more, nothing less. Ramirez lingered a little longer. "That's something I'll remember next time I start thinking I'm hot stuff on the range." She gave him a half smile. "It's not about beating anyone, Sergeant. It's about hitting what you aim for, and knowing why you aimed in the first place. When she walked back toward Lane 7 to pack up her things, the range seemed to hum differently than it had earlier. The noise was still there, the distant cracks of rifles, the shuffling of gear, but there was also a sense of quiet respect that followed her, like an invisible shadow. Lawson stayed behind for a moment, watching her go. When Ramirez asked what he was thinking, the colonel simply said, "She could have stayed one of the deadliest shots in the country. Instead, she decided she'd rather save people. That's harder." Hayes frowned. "Harder than war?" "Much harder," Lawson said. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the range. The hum of gunfire continued in the background, but the energy was different now. The soldiers who had once barely noticed Emma Carter's presence were watching her in quiet intervals, some openly, others in quick glances. Emma was methodically packing her gear, empty magazines stacked neatly, the Glock secured in its case, the spent brass pushed into a small pile to be swept away. Her movements were unhurried, almost meditative. The shooting was over, but the echo of it lingered in everyone's mind. Michael Turner approached with his teenage son, a boy no older than 15, his cap tilted awkwardly, as if unsure how to stand. Turner's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there earlier in the day. "Emma," he said, "I want you to meet my son Jacob. He's just starting out. I figured it's worth introducing him to a real example of skill." Emma crouched slightly so she was level with the boy. His eyes were wide, caught somewhere between awe and shyness. "You like shooting, Jacob?" she asked. He nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I want to be good at it. Like really good." Her smile was soft but deliberate. "Then here's something to remember. Being good with a weapon doesn't make you a hero. What matters is what you choose to do with that skill." Jacob tilted his head, frowning slightly in thought. "But if you can hit anything you aim at, isn't that the point?" She shook her head gently. "No. The point is deciding whether it's worth aiming in the first place. The hardest shot you'll ever take is the one you choose not to fire." Turner gave her a quiet nod of respect, and Jacob seemed to file the thought away, like a secret he'd carry for years. When most of the crowd had drifted back to their own lanes, Colonel Lawson approached one last time. His voice was lower now, more personal. "Carter, may I ask you something I never understood?" She glanced up from zipping her range bag. "Of course. You could have stayed in," Lawson said. "With your record, you could have trained the next generation, gone on to command teams, even worked in places that don't admit they exist. Why leave all that behind without telling anyone who you are?" She considered his question for a long moment, the sounds of the range filling the space between them. Finally she said, "Because, Colonel, I learned something after I left the Army. The most powerful thing about having the ability to take a life is deciding not to. Every skill I learned still helps me. Discipline, focus, staying calm when it matters most. But I use it now to keep people breathing instead of making them stop." Lawson studied her face, the quiet certainty in her tone. "And you think that's more important?" She nodded once. "Yes, because the truth is, the damage I could do will always be a part of me. But the lives I save, those are the ones that matter." The colonel's expression softened in a way few had seen. "That's why you were my best student, Carter. Not because you could hit anything you wanted, but because you understood that every shot has a cost. And that mercy, when you can give it, is worth more than any bullseye." Sergeant Davis stepped forward, holding a laminated card. "Ma'am, I've documented today's scores for the range records. Would you sign it? For the books." Emma took the pen without hesitation. Under her name, she wrote in neat block letters, "In memory of those who didn't come home, and in honor of those who still can." When she handed it back, Davis gave her a sharp nod, as though committing the moment to memory. She slung her bag over her shoulder and began walking toward the exit, the late afternoon light spilling through the open doors. Word had spread quickly. Even shooters who hadn't seen her in action came to the front to shake her hand or offer a nod of respect as she passed. Ramirez called after her, "Carter, one last thing. With skills like yours, why nursing? You could have done anything." She paused at the doorway, hand resting lightly on the frame. The sun lit her face in gold and shadow. "Because every trigger I don't pull is a life I might save instead," she said. "And that's the most accurate shot I can take." Then she stepped outside, the sound of the range fading behind her, replaced by the quiet hum of the North Carolina countryside. The air smelled of sun-warmed grass and distant pine, a reminder that the world beyond the scope was bigger, gentler, and worth preserving. 2 days later, at Charlotte General Hospital, Emma Carter moved to the trauma unit in scrubs instead of range gear. Her hands were steady as ever, but now they were busy stitching wounds, adjusting monitors, and reassuring patients with the same calm focus she'd once brought to her rifle. Her colleagues had no idea that she'd silenced an entire range with a handful of perfect shots over the weekend. No one knew about Colonel Lawson's proud half-smile or the way seasoned soldiers had stepped back in respect, and she liked it that way. The only thing that mattered now was the patient in front of her, the life still within reach. She pressed gauze against a wound, feeling the faint pulse beneath her fingers, and thought about what Lawson had said. True strength wasn't about destruction. It was about preservation. And as she worked, she realized that in its own way, every life she saved was another bullseye, the kind that didn't leave holes in paper, but filled them in hearts. At the range, her legend had already started to take root, whispered from one lane to the next, told in the break rooms and over mess hall coffee. The quiet nurse who shot like no one they'd ever seen. But Emma wasn't thinking about that. She was thinking about the boy, Jacob, and hoping he'd remember her words the next time he picked up a rifle. Because the truest measure of a marksman wasn't in the shots they fired, but in the ones they let go.